Okay, so hello, welcome to the first Writers Speak event of the semester. My name is Duncan White, and I convene this series for the Mahindra Humanities Centre. And this evening it is my great pleasure to introduce Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, who will be in conversation with Laura van den Berg. Nana has swiftly developed a reputation as one of our leading satirists, whose fiction ranges between the surreal and the speculative in daring and inventive ways. At the University of Albany, he studied under the novelist Lynn Tillman, who encouraged his ambitions to become a writer, which he pursued in an MFA program at Syracuse, where he worked with Dana Spiotta and George Saunders. Nana published the highly acclaimed short story collection Friday Black in 2018, a book which won the Penn Stein Book Award and resulted in his being selected by Colson Whitehead as a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree. When putting together this collection, Nana had originally considered including a story about prisoners pressed into lethal gladiatorial combat as a form of popular entertainment. This idea sprouted into his debut novel, Chain Gang All-Stars, which was published last year to rapturous critical reception. Among other honors and awards, it was a finalist for the National Book Award and was selected by the New York Times as one of its top 10 books of the year. In conversation with Nana is the wonderful Laura van den Berg. She is the author of 3 novels and 4 short story collections. Her work has won numerous awards, and she has been the recipient of prestigious fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her most recent collection of stories, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears, published in 2020, was named one of the best books of that year by Time, NPR, and Harper's, and her most recent novel is State of Paradise, which was published this year to rave reviews. Laura is a senior lecturer in creative writing here at Harvard. Okay, please take a moment to silence your cell phones if you haven't already. There's going to be an opportunity to ask questions later in this event, and we just ask that you raise your hand and make sure that we can hear that question when it arises. So we're going to start with a short reading from Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana, but please first join me in giving a warm welcome to Nana and to Laura.
Thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate that. That's very kind. How are you guys feeling today? Appreciate it. I'm feeling all right. Thanks for asking. Except for the omnipresent dread regarding, but not limited to, the country in which I was born's complicity in ongoing genocide. Sorry, we're starting heavy, I guess. And also the genocide that's happening internally in these prisons continually that we are sort of less attuned to. Other than that, I'm doing great though. I'm doing okay. I usually think of some specific little funny thing to talk about, but on the train today, I got an email from Charles Don Flores. Have you guys heard this name before? The New York Times has spoken a little bit about him, has written a little bit about him. He's a man on death row in Texas. He's been there for about 25 years. He's the entire time he's been on death row, he's maintained his innocence. And there's an eyewitness that caught him at a scene in which someone was shot. But they have video of that person being literally, I don't know if you guys have heard of interrogative hypnosis. Have you guys heard of this? This is the thing, you can Google it. It's unadmissible in several states, and even Texas now, but sometimes police officers will conduct hypnosis with the idea that they'll help you discover some sort of latent memory so that you can be a more acute witness for some crime. It sounds like I'm making this shit up. I promise you it's real. 100% it's real. And because of this book, which is about an imagined future in which convicted wards of state can opt out of a sentence of at least 25 years and participate in death matches. And if they survive 3 years in this sort of gladiatorial blood sport, they get clemency, they're freed. A lot of my travel, I've gone to go inside prisons. I've been in Parchment Farms is what they call it now. It sounds like they make butter or something. They actually do, because working farm. But it's also a prison, a plantation and a prison. I think they try to avoid that word plantation now. Not great optics. But that's what it is. And I had a great conversation about the book in that prison. I've gone to prisons in New York, where I'm from. And I was recently in Texas, Houston, Texas, and I wasn't allowed to go see both Charles and another person because, I don't know, someone said I couldn't. And I don't know, the things that I'm talking about in this book feel more and more alive. And for me, like the link between our carceral system internally and the militarized industrial complex externally, they really come from the same heart. And it's really scary. On that note, I'm gonna read a little from the book. I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning of the book. I say the beginning and not the prologue because I once canvassed Twitter and I was like, you guys, when you see prologue in a book, you definitely read it, right? The results were varied at best. The prologue is part of the book. Please read it. I'm gonna read just a little bit, but I need a little help from y'all. You guys think if I raise my hand, you guys can say like a word on command together? So enthusiastic. I love those nods. The word will be bishop, all right? So let's practice. 1, 2, 3. Bishop. All right, just like that, but like better. You know, like 1, 2, 3. Bishop. Woo. Chills. I love it. This is the beginning of the book. It's called the not prologue. It's called The Freeing of Melancholia Bishop. It's where we meet our protagonist, Loretta Thurwar. She felt their eyes, all those executioners. "Welcome, young lady," said Mickey Wright, the premier announcer for Chain Gang All-Stars, the crown jewel in the criminal action penal entertainment program. "Why don't you tell us your name?" His high boots were planted in the turf of the battleground, which is long and green, stroked with cocaine white hash marks like a divergent football field. It was Super Bowl weekend, a fact that Wright was contractually obligated to mention between every match that evening. "You know my name." She noticed her own steadiness and felt a dim love for herself. Strange. She counted herself wretched for so long, but the crowd seemed to appreciate her boldness. They cheered, though their support was edged with a brutal irony. They looked down on this black woman, dressed in the gray jumpsuit of the incarcerated. She was tall and strong. They looked down on her and the tight coils of black hair on her head. They looked down gleefully. She was about to die. They believed this the way they believed in the sun and the moon and the air they breathed. "Feisty," Wright said with a grin. "Maybe that's what we should call you. Little Miss Feisty." "My name is Loretta Thurwar," she said. She looked at the people all around her. There are so many of them. So many waves of humans who would never be the object of such cruel attention, would never know how it made you feel both tiny and all-powerful. How the thrum of thousands was so loud, so constant, it could disappear from your ears but continue to roar as something felt in the body. Thurwar gripped the weapon she'd been given, a thin, spiraling corkscrew with a cherrywood handle. It was light and simple and weak. "Not Little Miss Feisty, then?" Wright said, walking a wide orbit around her. "No." "That's probably for the best, Loretta." He stepped toward his box. "I hate wasting good names anyway." He laughed and the crowd echoed him. "Well, Loretta Thurwar." He threw his playful condescension directly at her, chopping her first name into 3 hard syllables, using a sing-song child's voice for her last. "Welcome to the battleground, baby." There was an electric cough in the air, and Thurwar was pulled down so forcefully she feared for a moment her arm had been dislocated at the shoulder. Kneeling, not knowing what else to do, she started to laugh. Chuckling first, then deep laughter. The feeling of hold that came from the magnetic implants in her arms was actually one of gentle massage under the skin. She could wiggle her fingers freely, but her wrists were glued to the platform, the ridiculousness of it all. She laughed until she felt out of breath. Then she laughed some more. Then the bells began to sound. Wright screamed into the air, "Please rise for Her Majesty!" He ran the rest of his way to his announcer's box. The crowd stood on their feet. They held themselves still and erect for her. She walked into the full football field, aluminum alloy on her arms, braids that stopped at the back of her neck, exposed shoulders each tattooed with the Whole Market trademark logo. A series of rods jutted out from her chest guard and encircled her muscled abdomen to form a sleek cage. It was a custom creation. Derwar had watched, even cheered, the first time she'd seen that the metallic pieces, initially thought to be exclusively defensive, were more. She'd been watching, huddled with the others in her cell block around the streaming video feed when the woman had removed 2 of the rods from her guard and pressed them into Slingshot Bob's eyes. And now, Derwar was seeing them up close. This was Melancholia Bishop's final fight. Bishop had made it. She had done what no woman before her had done, survived 3 years on the circuit. 3 years of slamming down her hammer, Has Omaha, and swiping her mace, Vega. 3 years conquering souls. Drowned King County's very own Queen of the Damned. All she had in her hands was her helmet, Melody's helm, Crusader style, made of tin with a gold cross down its middle. The Annihilator, the bad news bitch, the death songstress herself. The 7th bell rang, the people screamed. For years, this had been their sacred ritual. The 7 bells of Melancholia Bishop. They'd seen her wipe scum from the earth. They'd seen her kill women and men who they'd once claimed to love. Now she stood and looked out at them for the last time. Soon, she would be free. Melancholia! Bishop. Melancholia! Bishop. Melancholia! Bishop. The crowd chanted. Her brown eyes explored the bleachers. Then she raised the helm above her head. Once it was on, she was home. Melancholia! Bishop. Melancholia! Bishop. Melancholia! Bishop. For the last time ever, Wright cheered. Please help me welcome the winningest woman to ever step on the battleground. The mistress of the murder ballad, the sacred sweetheart, the crusader. The baddest the planet has ever seen. Your very own Melody Melancholia Price. Your very own, Derwar thought, routed by the force of love that exploded out from the audience. They loved her so, and still, this woman, despite it all, belonged to none of them. She had an aura about her that made that clear. It was enough to push Derwar's eyes down to the ground, as if the woman in front of her truly were royalty. Derwar watched, bowed in her keep, an impossible power in front of her, the hammer, the mace. On one side of the field, there was a knight in her armor. On the other, there was Derwar in a jumpsuit, a corkscrew slick in her clammy hands. Thank you, guys. Hey. Shout out to the sound for being able to do that. I should have said I was going to yell into that. I appreciate you.
Nana, thank you for that amazing reading. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm excited to talk about, I thought maybe I would start by asking you about speculative fiction, near future fiction. I think, this novel brings us into a near future world. A lot of the stories in Friday Black also bring us into near future worlds or versions of our world that are just like, the reality is like a few clicks off from where we are presently. But these dystopian worlds have so much to say about our current reality. And I think for me, at least, as a reader and also a writer, the thing that's really compelling about speculative fiction is that it's less about inventing stuff that doesn't exist, but taking what's already in our worlds and amplifying it to such a degree that we're able to make fresh contact. And I'm wondering if that interpretation. Oh,
the mic.
Yes, thank you.
See, they got their eye or ear and everything.
Yes. Okay. Is that good? Are we good? Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. Do I need to repeat anything, or was that okay? That was legible. Audible. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that sort of understanding of speculative fiction, does that resonate with you?
Yeah.
How do you think about it? How do you approach creating these worlds?
It's a great question, and it's funny because I remember the first time I'd ever seen the word speculative. It was in a review for my first book. And I remember being like, how dare they say that? And then I looked it up and I was like, oh yeah, that's pretty much me, yeah. I just had I had never encountered the term. And now it's like the banner I think people think I'm holding. I have a whole thing about like different genre or whatever. And I try my best to answer your question. I like embrace all sort of genre tags, but I don't think about them ever, actually. In the process of writing, it's not something I think about, except I can acknowledge that there's a strong utility in creating a world that's familiar, but not exactly that world. There's not only a utility, there's something fun for me to create like these allegorical spaces or this space that is familiar, but also transformed. There's a effect in creating like a fun house mirror that people can be like, oh, I hate that. But then when they really lean into it, they realize that's not so far from what is looking back at them in their own lived life. So to me, it's just fun. Today, I'm wearing my nerddom sort of literally on my sleeve, I guess. So it's probably not super surprising that like I'm a friend of anime, and I feel like a lot of Eastern things that I take in are not afraid to sort of pair like high action things with like deep philosophical conversation.
Yeah.
And if that's speculative, then I feel really connected to that, where that is to say like things that have engaging quote unquote action or whatever, but is also willing to hopefully comment meaningfully about the world we're living in as we're living in it.
Yeah. Okay. Since you brought up anime, I
brought it up before I even said a word.
Yeah. I had a question about that, but this is like a perfect bridge. I've read. I mean, one thing that I think also is like just really interesting about this novel formally is that it is engaging like a number of different genres, right? We have near future, dystopian. There's also kind of a mystery narrative tucked within the larger. This is gonna be a spoiler-free zone in case you haven't read the book, but there's a character named Sunset who's murdered before the novel. This is not giving anything away. Murdered before the novel starts, and so there's also this kind of investigation or quest to understand what happened to this character and why was he killed. He's a very important part of the chain that Thor War and also Hurricane, who's another central character, belong to. And I'm just, I mean, so we can see like a lot of different forms coming together to tell this one story. Okay, maybe I'll pause the anime question a little bit later, but just thinking about, like the novel and the way that it gives us space to call on these different influences, call on these different forms, in order to make a world. Like, can you just talk about the experience of just the expansiveness of that canvas versus stories?
It's a really good question, and I think in some ways, like this book really is sort of like comes right off of me writing my first book, which is a short story collection, and in that book, when I wrote it in grad school, I was at Syracuse, and there was a period of time when I was like figuring myself out as a writer where I really struggled with like, am I this kind of person or am I that kind of person? Like, meaning, do I write quote unquote realism or quote unquote not realism? Because again, I think the distinction is more blurry than I think we tend to give credit to. But I was really, and I was also feeling afraid and hesitant to like really evoke humor, which is like a big part of my like person. But you want to be like a serious, like, writer.
Taken seriously.
Yeah. And I was afraid of being like saying funny jokes. But also I was afraid because I'm interested in serious things. But I think through writing that book, I learned that sometimes humor is the way for me to say exactly what I want to say seriously. You know, sometimes that is a way for me to make space to talk about whatever it is I want to talk about. So that was one piece. I think that I had like a little taste of writing like action sequences or whatever, and I started also like getting into like film and directing like a little bit before pandemic, but I think that part, like really emphasizing visual and like scenes, like almost like set pieces, was big. I play video games. I think I'm interested in that form of storytelling. So I have a ton of influence. I'm interested in poetry and music. So by the time I got to really being into this book, I don't know if this is true anymore, but when I started in my heart, I feel like I'm a short story writer. Yeah. I feel like that's my soul form, like my natural form. But I was like, if I'm gonna do a novel, I really need like a reason to do it. And one of the challenges that felt fun was like, how can I make like really potentially disparate things feel like a choir that's in harmony? And so some of the fun is bringing together some of those things you're talking about. And the mystery aspect came like really surprisingly late, if you can believe that. What? Yeah.
That's so
the sunset
very
thing,
important. Yeah.
To the point where like there's another character who's called Gunny Puddles now, and initially he was called Sunny Puddles, but I couldn't have a Sunny Puddles and a sunset, so I changed it. But it was like really late because I think I don't know, revision is the bigger part of my process, but if you would have asked me, mystery novels and mystery things can be really like frustrating because they have like certain tropes that they have to follow. But a part of generally, I think I feel really interested in things that feel hard or difficult. So like if you ask me about footnotes, I don't like footnotes, but I put them in the book because I was like, I want to challenge myself to like reverse engineer what I mean by I don't like footnotes, and what about it don't I like, and how can I make something that feels I'm resistant to engaging. With the mystery stuff, what don't I like about mystery stuff? Mystery stuff can be tough because they require this sort of moment where like time pauses and somebody just tells you everything, you know, like that moment, and it's very satisfying on some level, but it also feels narratively tricky to me.
Yeah.
And I still have one of those, but like I tried my best to not make it feel so like, I don't know, easy or familiar. I just saw a meme on the way here on the train where how in every detective thing, like so much would be easier if the detective just communicated exactly what they're discovering in the moment, but they're always like, wait, what was that? Damn it, he's here again. And everybody's like, what do you mean? And he's like, this time it's gonna be different. They just walk off, storm off. But somebody in the comments was like, every single episode of House.
Yes.
I don't know if House is way too old for kids now, but every single episode he discovers something, he just like limps away. If you know, you know. It's called House, whatever.
If you don't know, you can look it up. It will be, yeah.
If you don't know, thank you. My students, my current students, and I teach at a grad program. When I started teaching, I was pretty young. So I was like young and cool, and now I'm just finally like outside of the super young teacher like space. And one of my students said this thing that's still haunting me. One of my class is amazing, I love them, but she said, I don't know, I said something about my age or whatever, I don't know how it came up. She said, not you born in the 1900s. I said, what? Not you born in the 1900s. I said, oh my God. Anyways, that's not relevant right now.
As someone who started teaching in their early to mid 20s, I find this highly relatable. Yeah. The references were like tracking, and then there was a certain moment where, I
don't know what they talk about. I barely have a TikTok, anyways.
Okay, back to this book. One thing that moved me so much about Changing All-Stars is the way like we are in this totally brutal world where incarcerated people are fighting each other literally to the death, and it's for the like extraordinarily slim chance of winning their freedom. But the characters still persist in imagining a better world. And I wanted, if I may, to just read a little bit, just these lines. This is from a character called Hurricane. So for those of you who haven't read the novel, Loretta Thurwar, who we heard a little bit more about in Hurricane, these two women are really at the center of the book. And Yeah, this is a little bit. She forced love into this loveless space, made it the subject of her life. She showed them that she, the hurricane, was capable of great love. And if they'd look, they'd see they were too. And maybe someday they would understand what they'd enabled, what they'd created. So like even in this moment of like horror and desperation, there's still that capacity to imagine forward. And I think that's true for I think in some ways that reflects like, for me as a reader, at least the broader worldview of the book, where it's like, yeah, like the book is not in any way backing away from this brutality and showing it for what it is, but also there's always like to the I love the way this novel ends, though I won't say how it ends, but till the very end, there's always this capacity to imagine something different. Yeah. I'm wondering, like, what can you tell us about that choice?
It's such a good question. I really appreciate you reading that. For me, and I guess for probably a lot of writers, like that capacity to imagine different, imagine better, imagine other is like the superpower. It's sort of like our mega gift, our super blessing. Sometimes it can be our curse because our imaginations are tampered or tamped down or funneled towards violence, towards control, towards reductiveness, towards exclusion. Because we're really good at imagining fear, something to be afraid of, something to run away from. And it's shocking. Again, we see it all the time. If you can stoke up people's fear, they'll do almost anything and respond to almost anything. Hence this omnipresent dread I referenced earlier and the situation we're in right now. But you can do it the other way too. You know, you can use that power of imagination to like remind people like, oh wait, like what a like sort of incredible and beautiful thing it is to be alive. You can use that imagination to grow your capacity or potential for grace. And in some ways, Stax, or her like stage name's like the Hurricane Stax, Hamara Stacker, or the Hurricane Stax. She kind of does something not that dissimilar to what I feel like in some ways writers are doing. Is she's created this like character. You have to have like because she's in this like almost like WWE type of situation, she has this character called the Hurricane Stax, who's super brutal, the best at killing, which engages the people, at violence, but she has a message with it. And so and it's like it's almost like when I have this time to reflect, like there's been a couple of times now, my first book got a story called Through the Flash, where there was almost like a similar thing where this woman, a young person, was very good at violence, but she kind of got past that, and now she had a different message. And Stax kind of has become this person who has this character that people are engaged with, and even though she's forced into these dark circumstances, she's showing even with this like harshness around me, look what I can be. And then hopefully you can see that too. And I feel like for myself, I'm connected to like artists who remind us of like our better potential, our better destiny. And I also generally believe, like when I say these things that tamp down our imaginative potential, the carceral state, the fact of the carceral state even existing outside of it's like what it's actually doing. I could get into like how it totally destroys our ability to respond compassionately to the disease of addiction, for example. It totally destroys our ability to take seriously and respond compassionately to those in mental health crisis. It individualizes and criminalizes systemic issues like poverty. Those are all true, and I don't think I could say all that. I don't think anyone even questions that. But because of the fact of prison, we don't have to imagine better for any of those issues, because it's like, well, whatever. It's like, and probably not that strong analogy is like, if you just throw everything in the closet, you don't have to actually figure out better organizational tools. But a much worse one, because it's like instead of organizational spaces, it's like the nature of our hearts. I think it's very badly like limited by the fact of the prison. And it's funny because I wrote this book and I'm feeling it more now that I'm like going into prisons a lot. I'm like, oh, like I believe this more than I did when I started, because you can. Anyways, yeah, the system we have really requires us to imagine that every single person in prison is about to kill us, or else I don't think we would agree to it. And even if we don't like intellectually have that belief, sort of like our spirit sort of believes that, or holds some version of that, including myself. And by better storytelling, by being willing to create better institutions, by pushing on that, starting with a different type of imaginative capacity, a lot can be super different. And so I think that Stacks, because she is in it, but also is just a big-hearted person, sees that.
Yeah. Can you tell us what some of the prison visits have been like? Like what kinds of, like, what have those conversations been like? Or what are some things that have really stayed with you?
Yeah, and one of them I thought I wasn't supposed to talk about, but they posted it on Facebook. So like, I guess it's free game now. So when I went to Mississippi, that was the one that like, I've done a lot of book events, and you know how book tours, like it can almost get like, first of all, I really appreciate these questions. And so like, I feel like very like engaged, and I'm always engaged, but sometimes you almost like saying the same thing over and over again. Long story short, I cried in my event in Mississippi, which that's never happened to me before.
Yeah.
Because
usually if you cry in book tours for like
no, I've cried I've cried in like the bathroom of an airport.
Yeah.
Because I'm just so like stressed out.
Yes.
Like that's different.
Yeah.
But in terms of during my event, because they were so thoughtful. It's the best events I've ever done. So thoughtful. They read with a really, really intense precision. There's a character called Barry Rave Bear Harris right in the beginning of the book. I've done a zillion events. No one will ever talk about him because he's like a side character. He dies very early on. They are him. So they have a lot of capacity to feel compassion towards him. Because they know what it is to be forgotten and killed off in chapter 2. And they are also extremely aware of what they've done. And because of that, again, I'm not trying to like paint the prison like some like beautiful like utopia. It's a ton of violence. The atmosphere is violence. I happen to be with a group of men who are older. They're gonna die in prison even though they're not there for life. A lot of them are either just older or have like terminal illnesses, which is a thing I think, again, people don't think about that when you think about prisons. So again, I'm not trying to act like everything is fine. People hurt people in prison, just like they hurt people outside the world. But the place I went to, it felt like I was with like a bunch of like uncles and like abuelos, basically, you know? And they read really, really thoughtfully. And they were basically like, first of all, they were so grateful I was there, but they also like tell them that we're like thinking about these things, meaning the outside world. Like, I don't want to say that they've achieved the state of grace, but they're trying to in a way that like you and I are not. Maybe you are. Let me not say you might be doing that, but a lot of us are so interested in like our daily pursuits of like success and in a sort of like let me go become more successful so that I can like support my life, whatever, which is a good thing. And they're trying to wrestle with the difficulty of the fact that they've done harm. And that is a very important and useful energy that's getting wasted. And they're aware of that waste too. So that one was one. Then recently I was in after that I was in Shawagunk. This is in New York, upstate New York. And the conversation again was super brilliant, really great. And one dude, I'm not gonna say anybody's names, but he came up to me after, and he had been in for a long time, but he had a kid coming now, even in the time that he's gone because of, conjugal visits or whatever. He had a kid coming on the way. And he told me this after all, but he took me to the side to talk to me. Probably my age, maybe a little bit younger. I'm 33, he's probably like in the early 30s. He said, so I have a kid now. The kid is like, let's say 1 or 2 years old. And in the last like 5 months, he's like up for, basically he can apply for like parole. Like he can apply to get out. And he can't, because now that he has a kid, he understands what he took away from someone. We didn't talk about, but I could tell he was there for murder. And now he can't, like he doesn't believe he should get out now. And he's wrestling with this. And I just found it like, and again, a really smart writer, really great, like he super sharp dude. And I remember just being so like moved by this, And so sometimes it's really heavy because you have to hold that, because what do you do with that now, But they've been the most meaningful events I've ever done out of like hundreds that I've done, both books. And I almost feel like I try now. What I say is not that different than what it used to be, but I almost feel like now part of the purpose of me coming to spaces to be like, just so you know, like these are human beings that are in cages, and the institution is also like housing innocent people like Charles Don Flores. If you could look up the story, Charlie Flores, he's in Texas, and it's sad. So, anyways, I don't know. It's it's been life-changing for me because, and I already was thinking about it. I came to this book for a lot of reasons. I think I'm interested in infrastructures that keep us from being more compassionate, things that trick us into stepping on each other's heads. My father, when he was alive, was a criminal defense attorney. I think that did something for me. But I just stumbled onto something, but I actually feel like it's really closely tied to like a lot of like our big social ills.
Yeah.
That is to say, like, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about the organized abandonment of communities. And to me, that's what prison is. And I think the challenge is to like, okay, what does it look like to create organized non-abandonment of community? And so,
yeah,
let's do that. No, I'm like, easy, you know, but it's gonna be hard, but like, I think it's a fundamental reimagining is like required for us to get to where we hope to get to.
I'm thinking of what you're saying about, wrestling with having done harm and seeking like, or trying to figure out what would grace mean? What would that look like? And one thing that I also find really moving about this book is that there's so, on Loretta's chain, there's a lot of tenderness among the links. And you might, given the premise, you might enter into this novel expecting, it's going to be like one deathmatch scene after another. And we have probably like the two most like vivid graphic battles occur in the beginning of the book. And then some we glimpse in other ways, but like a lot of the narrative is in a more contemplative space, is in a more offstage space. We're following the lead up to Loretta's last fights. And there's so much tenderness. There's a real desire for figuring out like what in this world does like intimacy, community, grace look like. And so I'm wondering, I've started to think of tenderness as a form of agency, maybe in this context. Yeah. So I'm wondering if that lands with you, and also like just that choice to kind of actually decenter the physical violence and not make that the primary narrative. Like, what can you tell us about those choices?
Really good question. I really appreciate it. First, yes, to with the tenderness, and I'll say even more about it if I remember. But in terms of like front loading the violence, essentially, structurally, I feel like I can't say like I super how on purpose it was, but it's something, again, I think that I sort of have learned. I think that as an American person, like my taste, my reaction to violence is like big. All of us, as a human being, I think your reaction to violence is big. I also know that there's a certain kind of like, you could hook somebody with like a fight. Mm-hmm. Somebody's fighting, people will look. But my frustration so often is like where the fight is the thing. That feels like a missed opportunity to me. The example I sometimes give, and I don't mean to like shit on everybody's like favorite, but like in how many times can how many people can you kill because they killed your dog before?
Yeah.
Before you're now a terrorist, John Wick.
Yeah.
Or Keanu.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter because like an important part of us appreciating that film is to basically think of everyone he shoots as like not really a person. Mm-hmm. Like I think that's like I don't think even they would say that's not. I don't think even they would disagree with that. Mm-hmm. Me and the creators. But that paired with like a country that does that is really tricky. And I say that as a gamer, mm-hmm. That is another medium where like at some point we have to wrestle with these like mediums that like actively and fundamentally ask you to think of life as less than sacred because it's cool to get a headshot. I say this again as someone who like partakes in those things. but not in my own art though. So like for me, it's really important to create that big violence, almost get some of people to like lean in because they're like in that rah-rah mode. And then sort of like, once that hook is set, make that much less of what the book is about. It's really, and I've sort of just learned that like what people see first is what they think it is. You know, funny enough, it's like when you're sequencing an album, the first 2 songs or first song is so important because that's just what people think about. In my first book, the first story had to do like really deeply with race, and I feel like since then it was like that's all I've ever written, if for some people's minds, because it had a race and it had a violence, and it was speculative. So because of that, like I'm a speculative writer forever. Even though I write quote unquote realism all the time too. Not all the time, but some of the stories in there were very human scale realism. Yeah. But people don't really think about that. In this book, because I started the way I started with these big set pieces of violence, I think people, I mean, also it's a violent book, but people like stick on that because it's right in the beginning. And there's just an energy that comes from that evocation of big violence. But what I try to think of it is like, instead of just making that explosion, I take that energy and like zero it down a particular thread towards this compassion and other stuff. So, and I guess the reason I have a lot of thoughts about it is like, I've heard like other people talk about this in other ways, like Marlon James, because it's almost like, if there's like I mean, maybe I'm just thinking about Goodreads too much or something, which is not, like, you know, if there's a big critique for me, generally it's like too violent. Yeah. Probably. And for me, I'm like, well, I guess what I'm saying, I just hope that the people who feel that way, like in some part of their lived life outside of taking in media, are resistant to the violence that's all around us all the time, everywhere. And so, yeah, I tried to front load with violence to sort of like create this energy and these like stakes, and also just because like, you know, like do like let people understand this context, and then hopefully that's like a really strong battery to get them through at least part of the next book, and then there's other batteries that are other things that are just like evoke sort of our almost visceral selves. I could talk a lot more about this, but like I feel like it could get too in the weeds. But yeah, I really appreciate like how you're like thinking about it, and then with the tenderness thing. Tenderness, sometimes being willing to pay attention to someone, being willing to really listen to them, giving someone a hug when they need it. It's really hard to do that in life when you're like, it's really hard to like just stop everything and like offer tenderness when you're stressed out yourself, when you're feeling anxiety, when you're in like a really difficult place. And I feel like, again, the Hurricane Stacks like really made that a practice, like an active practice of, I'm going to try to represent this tenderness because I know we all need it, and I need it too. And this kind of can nourish me in this harshness. So I absolutely do think it's like a not only a currency, but like a boon in like in a desert. Yeah, well, it's like, and if the sort of promise is though like unlikely but possible that you can win freedom, but it's like your soul has to survive too. Otherwise, what good is that? Yeah. At what cost? Yeah. What good is that freedom? And again, that's the person I emailed today, like Charles, his spirit was so good. Like his attitude was so kind. He read the book with such generosity. Because if he wanted to, he could really like be like, this fucking sucks, shit on me, like, and I would have to hold it. And it was just like 25 years. Imagine 25 years, something you didn't do. It's almost like guaranteed, it's pretty much certain he didn't do it. 25 years, and you still hold some kind of grace for people in the world, you know? Yeah. It's really inspiring. So, yeah. Yeah. I have, I think, 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up into the audience. So, hi, lovely audience. Prepare start thinking of your questions. So you had mentioned before that you feel like the short story is your soul form. Do you feel like, are you writing stories now? Do you feel like you'll go back to stories at some point? And as an adjacent question, I think to a lot of readers, it's obvious why a short story writer would want to write a novel, right? Because it's like all this book can hold, like a short story can't hold that. But just to reverse engineer that idea a little bit, what do you feel like as an artist the short story can offer you that novels can't? Wow, again, I wish people asked that question because they never ask that. It's always like, if you write a short story collection, like, oh, when are you going to do a novel?
I
You know,
love
you get
stories. Yeah, and I also feel like that's my sort of soul form.
And they don't do it the other way,
yeah,
though.
no, I know. Yeah.
I want someone to come out with an album and be like, so when are you going to write your next short story collection?
Yeah. I mean, I think people are still asking, like, you know, someone like Deborah Eisenberg,
Yes.
you know, like.
I had a weird...
Like, all these stories are fine, but...
Legendary, one of the most legendary living writers in the world. I had a weird bottle episode with her once at one of these book festivals. Deborah Eisenberg, again, if you write short stories, she's a big deal. So she's a big deal with me. And she was super nice and super funny. And we like hung out for like, you know, the festival, you just randomly make a friend. We hung out for like an afternoon. And then the next day at one of the events, on stage, in the big stage, they asked about, are you ever gonna do a novel? I was like, what, dude? She's like much older. Like, it just was ridiculous.
Yeah, she's been writing for really long. Like, she's made clear,
like way longer than I've been alive.
Yeah.
But yeah, so thank you for that question. I think that a lot. Okay, so first off, there's obviously like the market thing, right? The market sort of like, again, to me, like talks about like how the atmosphere or context shapes our imaginations. Novels are much more popular in terms of retail, and so like they get pushed. There's a push for that in that sense. What I love about short stories is that you just can't hide in them. You can't hide in a short story.
Yeah.
You can't. Like every word to me has to matter. Has to be for something. There's an economy that, to me, is sort of like one of my fundamental principles. I tell my student, like, a lot of times I put things in brackets or I strike through, but I'm like, don't take it with a grain of salt exactly, but know that that's like my go-to. Like, just cut it out. And I really like condensing things, because to me, that's like, you know, just how you get a stronger work. And so for me, with the short story, you can't hide. I like the feeling of the tip of the iceberg. I also like writing a book that can be just so many things. It feels like an album that can be so, I don't know, energetic. And I think it's part of why this novel has like very chaptery chapters, you know? Another thing about the short story, this is like more like, like kind of meta, I guess, or I don't know how to describe this, but like, again, I like people like George Saunders a lot. That's one of my mentors and like my really like serious professor. I think it's easier to like, or maybe I can say like this, it's hard to sustain a really, really inflected voice for a long, long time. The reader gets this like sort of like a fatigue about it. So in a short story, I can have like, or in a short chapter, for example, I can have a character like a Simon Kraft, this man whose mind has been really shaped and sort of molded by solitary confinement and torture, and have that be reflected in his language, and it's like finite, you know? Then I can do that I can let that sustain an entire story though in a novel, in a short story, as opposed to like having it be like this episodic thing. In a novel, you can do it too, but now you have this challenge of trying to make it sing against. Right. In this novel, you almost have Third War as like I call her like my middle C, you know, or like my sort of straight woman against which these other people can exist. With the novel, I don't need a straight person. I can just have the crazy stuff, you know? I mean, with short story, I can just have the crazy stuff. And so that's one thing that's really interesting to me. I like feeling like you've got the whole universe in just a couple pages, you know? So there's a lot of reasons, but I also think some of it might be just kind of like temperament.
Yeah.
I think I just get bored, you know, and I need to like go to something else. So that might be it too.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, the short story is like this really demanding form, I think. Because you can't hide. And it's like, I think there's so many novels that I love powerfully and that I recommend to people all the time. And it's with something like, you know, the first 100 pages is kind of like 2666, where I'm like, there's a really long part about these academics who are like wandering around this part of Mexico, like whatever. It's kind of, you know, it's not my favorite part of the book, but like just get past that, and you know, and then you're good. But it's like you never say that about a short story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of like fluff. There's a lot of novel. Again, it sounds like petty or something. It sounded more petty when I didn't have a novel. Now I think it sounds better. A lot of novels should be short stories, or like a lot of novels are like someone's pushed to make it a novel of a certain length at that, of arbitrarily like certain amounts of pages, and it does everybody a disservice, I think. it's also super arbitrary, like how like they're more popular. It's just dumb. I find it really silly. But even all that said, now that I have written a novel, I think that I'm kind of now I'm struggling. I am to answer that part of your question. I'm working on stories now, and I feel like I'm struggling again. So maybe, I don't know. I think I'm just a little bit malleable still. But I love, like, you could write 1 or 2 stories and become like one of my favorite authors off of that. You know, or one collection that really hits. ZZ Packard, one of my favorite writers off of that one book. Drinking Coffee Elsewhere is the name of it. And I feel that way. And I don't, the idea that just length is somehow, it's like if a song is 20 minutes long versus, it's just so, I find it so silly. I find it so arbitrary. I think it's, and sometimes if I start thinking about it too much, like if I get really in my bag about it, like mentally, like it makes me sad because we're supposed to be like the literary people, but we're like bigger, better, you know?
Yeah.
It's just so dumb.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
Like, and then like if you press anybody on it, like what they're gonna say is nothing like that real.
Yeah.
And things like that stress me out when I get too into it. I could say something similar about the genre thing too, whereas quote unquote literary world, which again, I am part of, and like when people used to ask you, what do you consider yourself? Like, I'm like, wherever like George, Toni Morrison, that part of the bookstore, I wanna be in that part.
Yeah.
But if you look at Toni Morrison, she evokes ghosts all the time.
Yeah,
she has all these things.
Yeah.
Like, so what are we even talking about?
Right.
We're not even saying anything. It's just made up. And that said, I understand when people who are super duper like, okay, a romance has to have these 3 like things. I understand that. But there's no reason why you can't have those things and still aspire on the line level.
Yeah.
There's no reason why you can't. And so like, what do we even mean when we say literary?
Yeah.
You know, I think if I asked everyone here, we'd have a bunch of different things we would say. I know for me, it has to do with like really like focusing on the way language is like being pushed and pressed and used to sort of like aspire towards something. But to me, literary also has to do with like caring a little bit about outside of the book, you know, to me. Like just because you could write a pretty sentence doesn't mean like I have to like have that real reverence for it. Yeah. Even though I could also, I could go too far into it because I think just representing beauty in the world can be a really important revolutionary act. I'm just saying that our labels and distinctions are like dumb, reductive, mostly selling tools, but we act as though they're real, and it's like really silly.
Yeah, like they're walls instead of just these fluid things that exist for mainly, as you're saying, for marketing.
For marketing, and also so that some of us at like certain places, institutions, probably like this one and anyone, like can feel like they're better than other people. Yeah. That's part of why I like when I go to like the conferences and I realize how small the literary part of the book world is.
Oh yeah.
It's tiny. Like a tiny little thing. And I think it's important, it's what I identify with, but I don't like all this like condescending and all this weirdness that is around it. It's a lot of silliness. It's also great, it's fine.
Hi. Do you have questions? I have like loads more questions. We have a mic. Yes, we have a mic. Hi, thank you for.
I saw one over there. So, wow. Yeah, right there. And then you will be able to just talk, and I'll repeat it close by.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the prison visits, how that was arranged, and also how this book was brought to be read by incarcerated people, and if that was at all difficult or what it was like arranging that.
I guess we're filming, right? We are. By very like standard and officially correct means, like I'm just like that's the thing that happens. Like there's classes in prisons. A lot of times it's class visits. A lot of times it's someone. A lot of times there's a lot of programs that have book clubs. It depends on the prison. I don't want to say too much about it, but yeah, it's usually facilitated by either someone who's teaching in an academic program that exists in the prison, or in Mississippi, it was actually the what do you call it? The boss, like the boss of a prison. Why am I forgetting the word?
Warden.
The warden, like, but the superintendent called him the super warden, like the top guy. His wife was like a big reader, and they were also brought in to like kind of change everything. it's funny because in terms of, I talk a lot about like compassion, growing compassion. Another part of the deal has been like trying to grow for like those who are like my enemies, like politically, I guess. And that's one place where it was really a really interesting thing had happened where this guy, who I would think, look, opposite of me, whatever, brought my book in, let me in, and he's trying to change the system that preceded him. It wasn't perfect, but it was like, there's some nuance there that I'm sort of learning the hard way, or not the hard way, but like in real time. But it's a good question. I would say more if it was different. I don't want to, you can just say it while they're coming down.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming.
They arrived.
Oh yeah, of course. Hello.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming. There's so many things, so I'm just gonna put like a lot of things down and then pick up whatever you want.
Yeah.
I think the most important thing for me that I want to put down is the anime piece, because I also love anime. I also play video games.
Yeah.
And what you said about how anime sort of merges deep philosophical considerations about the world we live in with like humor and sort of more like prototypical ideas of like what a cartoon is, I think is like really beautiful and really interesting, and like as a medium is so fascinating. And so would you consider writing like writing for an animated show, and like what do you think that would look like for you if you could explore animation, like anime, like Japanese or otherwise, to convey like these themes that you talk about? What would that look like for you, and is that something you're interested in?
Yeah, 100% I would. It's a good question. 100% I would consider writing for, I really want to write for a video game, like actually. I keep saying it on Twitter and hoping someone's gonna be like, here you go. One of my friends does it now. Do you know Tochi, the writer?
Yeah, not Chris.
Yeah. But anyways, he's like a real games writer. I'm hoping he like gets high enough and just can put me on. Well, I don't have like an idea right now that I would like want to be like a specific show like at this moment. One time I met somebody who was working on like the next Avatar, not Last Airbender, but After Core. They have a whole studio now, and I was like, I will do this. Like, let me do that. Like, it's gonna be Earthbender now. You know what I mean? I would 100,000,000% do that. If they're watching this in the future, like. So that's something where they already are familiar with the world, and I think there's like a lot of cool places you could take it. It would be something. Funny enough, I'm not like a huge fan of like gratuitous violence, So like even like something like Attack on Titan could be like too much for me, even though I love the show. I think it's one of the most important shows to ever come out, like in the last like whatever, said decade. Yeah, kind of low key ever. Someone was talking about how whatever. We can't do this right now, but I can't do that if I had to see it. It's just a little too much. So it'd be somewhere like not between Avatar as like really safe for like younger people and Attack on Titan, be somewhere in the middle of those two in terms of violence. Basically, I'm saying it'd be like not super violent, but kind of violent. Because I think that's just where I'm at in terms of if I had to see it myself. Because I couldn't do. And that's funny though, because we're interested in adapting Chain Gang, and I'm going to be involved in trying my best. But that's going to be a challenge for me, in terms of my own sensibility. But that's also why I feel like I have to be a part of it. Good question. To pass the mic right there.
Thank you so much for coming. I loved this book so much, and I think I've recommended it to everyone I've talked to this year.
Thank you so much. I owe you.
My question is about the reality television aspect of the book. Like there's the kind of like speculative violence, but there's also the part where they're being followed kind of by cameras wherever they go, even when they're not actively fighting. And I was curious, I guess, what particular shows or aspects of reality television most influenced your writing of that part of the book, and how you see that part interplaying with then watching the death matches.
Yeah, really smart question. I appreciate it. It's funny because the other day someone was like giving me like a crash course on all these new shows, which I have not watched any of them, but I'm like, that sounds crazy. I didn't know that 90 Day Fiancé was like a visa.
It's wild.
I'm like, how is this okay? Like legally, I mean. Like I don't understand how that would be. Anyways, I was around when like the OG things were coming out, like Survivor and Big Brother. So I feel like those are probably like, and we used to watch like with my family, you know? So I feel like those are certain things. The Real World, is that a thing for people still? Those like early things were huge for me. I think, so that was in my mind, I guess, but I think I'm also just interested in how like more than like any particular show, how so much of life, at least it seems like we're all at kind of this ever-present reality TV show that we're making on Instagram and hoping that we'll do something funny or cool enough that some company like, I don't know, Chipotle will be like, wow, let's give them money. I remember when that like I like Corn Kid was like going crazy. And then Chipotle came out of nowhere and was like, here's a commercial. And I remember feeling like, I'm glad he got his bag. Like, I never want that to not happen. But I'm also like, is this what we want? Where like the goal is just to do enough internet random traction so that McDonald's swoops in and gives us money to support this thing that like, also do we even know or care what they do? No, not really. It's like, whatever. So I think I'm really interested in how we're all like, sort of like willingly or unwillingly, like perpetually, and I say this again, it's like, I'm not saying like I'm not in it, like I'm in it. I have a phone that I'm on Instagram. And yeah, there's something like a little like sad about that. How it's just like this like, it's like forever. That's what when I created the HMC, I was really thinking about how like, it's like, how we hold the Black Mirror, like, you know, like the show Black Mirror gets its name from like the phone in our hands. Everyone didn't know that. Someone just found it out right now. But that's why it's called Black Mirror. And I was like really thinking about that's where we're at now. And so that was in my mind too. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Da, 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 da. Oh, you're going on the right side.
Like elevator music.
I know.
Yeah.
I heard Pat Sajak stop doing Wheel of Fortune.
Really?
Yeah.
I actually have a very quick question for both of you. You both use the term grace, and I would like you to expand on the meaning of grace for both of you. Because I know it's a word that has many different meanings in many different contexts. What does grace mean to each of you? Thanks.
I like it. It's a big one. I'm like, cool. I'm like, you do the honors. Or I can go first if you want me to.
Sure.
I don't know what's about to come out of my mouth. When I think of, okay, so the way I used it was like these guys are like really like working towards grace. For me, it's like seeing fully. For me, grace is seeing fully and accepting fully. It's not being willing to dismiss wholesale. For me, grace is like an understanding that can only come from a nuanced appreciation and a love that sort of transcends the mistakes or the good too. For me, it's like a willingness to like fully see and appreciate, understand that's like someone or something is coming into a messy, difficult, hard world and was probably like trying and really, really holding on to that. For me, grace is seeing, like really seeing, being and trying maybe is better than doing, but like trying deeply to like accept is what I mean when I say that.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I think, you know, it can be easier to like work toward being the best versions of ourselves when like things in our life are easeful or we're not in the midst of a lot of conflict. And I think grace comes into play when like we're under pressure, when we're in difficulty, where it's actually like feels maybe even impossible for that best version to keep trying to step forward. I mean, this is sort of related to what you were saying. I mean, I think to me, grace is less about arriving at a particular destination, but more about the continual attempt. And the continual attempt in perhaps especially like the continual attempt in difficulty when it's actually like really, really hard to choose in a way that is like constructive and also in a way that, you know, honors our values and kind of keeps like the soul intact, which sounds like something we should want all the time. Like, why wouldn't we choose in that way? But sometimes the outside world actually like makes it really hard. So I think grace is in the attempt. Grace is in the struggle. Grace is in the pursuit of that better self. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have time. Yeah, maybe like 2 more questions.
I like that question. I feel like very like Plum Village right now.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys know.
Yeah, it was a fantastic question.
I'm like in my like, I think more because of this, like I'm in like my Tet Nahan era. Big time though, seriously. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Mine's also about a word. The opposite of grace. Like in the book also there's betrayal, denial, but there's also like a fair bit of rage like between the characters.
Yeah.
And also in the real world, like for incarceration and sort of all social justice issues that go with that.
Yeah.
I'm curious because I read a book about Attica prison, upstate New York. I don't know if you've been.
100%. I know it.
And the uprising that took there in the 70s and just the rage that was involved in that instance and the fallout of it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious about your experience with rage in writing and also just in general, like how do you cope with it and when you're dealing with these types of enraging topics?
Yeah. It's such a really good question. And rage feels like anger, but it feels more full-bodied. Feels like more like a truly justified like anger that like is really like for like a situation and all that's around. I think that in the situation you're bringing up, that rage, there's a super justified rage. You know, when the people are being treated horrendously and there's a human response to it. Rage is sort of like to me like an anger, sort of emotion that a lot of it I think comes from like wanting to protect something. So a lot of times like when unchecked it can be to protect our own ego or something, but I think a lot of times it's like a defensive protection sort of impulse. But and so I don't want to like diminish the power and like even utility of it because it can be actually like useful because sometimes you need that. And when I think about my own like work, I feel like my first book was like very like angry. I don't know if people would say, other people say, but I can see it for myself. I was so like caught up on like just like unfairness of like sickness in my family, like feeling like poor or whatever, like financially, and like I would like mention a lot of like housing insecurity stuff, like things that were like really making me upset. But luckily, I think that because of the people I was exposed to, and also like just having like the privileges I exist, I was able to like take some of that anger and rage and like sublimate it to something else, like also like tease it out. Sometimes sometimes rage can be a little bit unnuanced, you know, because there's usually like a lot of things in there. And sometimes even I can't, if you're the one who's feeling rage, sometimes you don't know, it can be like, it can lack clarity, I guess. But I think there's a power for it that was like, it's an engine that can like break through a wall, but sometimes it's not so precise, I guess. So I guess for me, like when I think about rage that I feel in working in topics like this, like is justified, you know. If I'm like what I'm saying, I'm keep saying because like on my head right now, like eventually Texas is going to kill a man who's innocent. Like I don't think my response would be like, yeah, you know, rage makes sense. But then it's like I feel like I just can't stop there, you know. I feel like there has to be something else too. So for me, like, again, this is talking about Plum Village is like the thing. I think I am also like, I feel like I used to be very competitive, and also I'm like a male in America. I feel like anger and rage is also like probably one emotional space that is sort of okay until you get to a certain age and it stops really abruptly. Then you can't do it. That's complicated, but it means that you have some access to it at least, which is not to say the same thing for like vulnerability or other emotional states that like I don't know that I got so trained in as a younger person. So yeah, I think it's important to like not try to cut yourself off completely from feelings of anger, but I think like having control and being able to like maintain clarity about what that rage is like sort of seed is feels super important for me. Such a good question.
Yeah, I think this will be our last question. Thank you.
I really appreciate that question. Both of those last questions. All these questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here and for
Thank
writing
you.
the book. I really loved it. My questions are a lot less deep, but I had two quick
We need
things.
it.
The first one is, I guess, about process. Like, did you have, while you were writing, fully formed thoughts about how to end it? You said that Sunset was a character you added in later on, but while you were writing it, did you know sort of how you wanted to end it, like these concepts of grace and maybe ending cycles? So that's my one question. The other one is much more silly. What's your favorite anime? And if you have any like short story recommendations, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to keep them on my mind. I use Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is like my easy like Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. That's like my easy answer. There's a bunch though. Even though obviously I'm wearing Dragon Ball, I think Dragon Ball is more like a good important like reference for all the shonen anime that come before it. But like when I watch it now, it's even hard for me to like. It's kind of silly. I love it though. Rest in peace, Akira Toriyama, the GOAT. But like Fullmetal is one that's really really trying to do something interesting like in a lot of different ways. A lot of people don't know it's written by a woman. Funny, a woman mangaka who like had one of the biggest things never brought up. How was that never brought up? Anyways, so I just say Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Then there was one question about process. What was like the? Yeah, but there was like another part of the anime. Short stories that I would recommend. Drinking Coffee Elsewhere is just a whole book of them. I love that. What am I like? Is it too like Garnier? I'm afraid to be like I don't care anyways. Dennis Johnson. I'm a Dennis Johnson person. Car Crash. Jesus' Son. Jesus' Son I read in undergrad. It changed like my whole idea about writing. Again, I'm like obviously a George Saunders stan. I like very specific stories in Pastorelli and 10th of December. Sometimes I don't like the really long ones in his books. For the same reason I was talking about earlier, I think it's hard to sustain those like super inflected voices. There's a story called Sea Oak. Yeah.
That was it. I read that as an undergraduate and that like changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sea Oak is funny because super serious story and it has one of my favorite lines in like maybe literature, which is, "Show your cock," she said, and died again. Period. Mwah. So yeah, that. And then in terms of like my process, I because I think it's another short story thing that I held on for too long. I was like, I don't outline. I don't need to do that. I'm an artist. Ridiculous. And it like wasted me years probably. But I didn't know the end. I tried my best not to know the very ending for a long time. I tried to discover it. And I also didn't even know, like, I've said it before and it sounds like a lie, but I didn't, like, I wrote the book, like, kind of like hoping I was an abolitionist, you know? And by doing the book, I discovered I really was. Mm-hmm. I can't say like I had some like answer, you know? And I don't think like fiction is trying to like give you like the answer per se. I think it's trying to ask high level questions or like form a communion between the reader where y'all are both asking high level questions of yourself in the world. And to me, if you're over-intentioned, that feels like that can hurt that. But what I discovered is you in terms of like outlining everything and knowing exactly where you're gonna go, that feels like it can hurt that honest, earnest question asking process. But I realize I can know what is materially gonna happen, but that's only half the story, you know? But the actual things that happen is not the plots is not the book. And there's a lot more that, you know, there's a lot of texture and energy in life that animates the plot. The plot's sort of like a body, but like you need like the soul, and that part you discover in the actual doing in the sentences. So no, I didn't know everything. And I even I was like more than halfway through before I even outlined anything, which is sort of, I don't know for you, are you an outliner for your novels?
I am chaotic. I start outlines, I throw them away.
Same.
I have like so much admiration for people who have these really organized processes that they can articulate. But I'm like, one day I started writing and one day I stopped.
Same. Same.
And a lot happened in the middle, but like it's like I feel like it's like being like inside a hurricane, you know, and you're just like, I know that there was a lot of wind and rain, and sometimes I was blown down and had to like recover myself. But yeah, and one day it all just went away.
On some level, every time you talk about it, like that's so much truer than like whatever like neat thing writers like to say when they're talking about their stuff. It's just like, even when you earlier when they were I went to say like I applied for the is it jinxing it? It's whatever. I applied for the Guggenheim this year, and they were so painful because you have to like type like what is your project? And I'm like, I don't know. You know, like it's so hard to talk about that stuff. And for me, this book took me like 7 years to write, and so much happened. And it wasn't, again, I like to say, I said earlier today, it wasn't like 7 years straight. I wasn't like in some room drinking a whiskey, smoking a cigarette. I don't smoke cigarettes, but I'm just saying for the, you know, I feel like writers like to like, you know, pretend like, toiling every day. No, I didn't do that. Like so much life happened. My other book came out, my dad like died. I had to like, so many things happen. And it's like somehow you got to the finish line. I was just as surprised as anybody. You know?
Yeah, I think it's so generous that readers, I think that we have like, designed this experience, but we were just like, we were just sort of like, possessed by it, and then somehow.
It's an absolute miracle. And then you got possessed, and you try to like create a situation where you can be possessed again over the course of years. And sometimes you failed, and mostly you failed, but then luckily you revise enough that hopefully every page can get touched by that like special thing. It's a really miracle. Like when I finished this book, I was like, I cannot believe that people just do this.
Yeah.
I can't believe that. I can't believe it. But I'm grateful.
Yeah. I think that is a perfect place to end. Thank you, Nana.
Thank you guys
all
so much.
so much.
I really appreciate it.